The Centurion Action X was one of the weakest tier 10s, but beware, this thing has gone from run to the litter to one of the top dogs, and today we get to see what all the fuss is about. So what has made this vehicle so special within World of Tanks? Of course, it is now the buffs to its damage per minute and gun handling that have changed this tank from being one of the mediocre mediums to one of the top dogs, and that is because this tank now has an increased reload from 8.6 seconds down to 8 seconds. It's an increase of 7.5%, meaning your damage per minute has gone up by 7.5%, which is a sizable buff. And of course this tank had fairly okay damage per minute to begin with, so it's just made this tank really easily able to tear through opponents if they're not keeping an eye on you. Now, one of my favourite things about seeing the Action X since the patch is that it can essentially be way more accurate when you're cresting over the ridgelines. Potentially one of the nicer vehicles to use on a ridgeline. It gets a little bit of turret armour. It's still not amazing because remember, everyone has heat rounds now, and essentially you do get penned quite badly by a lot of them because of the fact that the armour on the turret is pretty flat. And I mean, you do get penned in the upper turret, and you can also get penned in the cupola, and of course the main frame of the vehicle is the exact same. The hull armour does have big flat plates which heat loves, and of course yeah, you can certainly get torn apart if you get caught out in the open, but that's where these ridgelines come in and how you're able to target down opponents like this T30. Now, we've touched on dispersion and of course the changes that they've made to the gun handling, but what exactly were these changes? Well, they've actually severely increased the accuracy of the tank by reducing the dispersion on both the turret traverse, on the gun traverse, and of course on gun traverse when actually turning the hull of the tank as well. So you have had some significant changes, in fact like 40%. So these are pretty sizable, and it makes the gun way better when you are using it in this aggressive playstyle and where you can be this forward force that is essentially just ripping apart the opponents. I mean, here you would not usually see an Action X crumb into the opponents and come out like a top dog like you're seeing here. So it's really nice to see the Action X coming back into form within World of Tanks, and I'm interested to see your thoughts on whether you think the Action X has definitely got to the point where, you know, you could potentially use it over some of the more overpowered mediums, and whether you think it's now more competitive. Of course, it wasn't particularly competitive in the first place, but with these sizable buffs, then yeah, it's certainly more usable indeed. If you're enjoying watching the Centurions stomp around on the battlefield, then please consider stomping on that like button, as it massively helps out the channel and allows it to spread to more people. And if you want to see more videos like this, the subscribe button's there if you're interested. In these close quarters engagements, you feel way more confident when coming up against opposing tanks, because you can, you know, come out, you can side scrape, you can make micro movements that were a hell of a lot worse back in the day, and that's where this tank has kind of come into force, and maybe why I like seeing vehicles like this come away with the damage that they can deal. Now, of course, the tanks that you don't want to be seeing are things like the Char Futur, because you have essentially pretty much paper on this vehicle, which likes to get penned quite easily. Now, luckily here you're seeing some nice work against the Char Futur, obviously knowing that having a tank like that left in the game at this point in the game is potentially a misplay if you allow it to get away with YOLOing you. So it's nice to see a few rounds going to him, but of course the dogged nature now of the Centurion, able to kind of brawl it out with some of these heavy tanks as well as some of the mediums that might try and come towards you. Now, of course, for some reason this Char Futur is getting a little bit horn for the Action X, and it's probably not going to pay off all too well. But of course you can't avoid the probably the worst tank in the game, the artillery. No, unlucky with the shell there, but yeah, certainly a way better, more easily readily available. Now, before anyone gets carried away, now this tank is not overpowered. It is certainly has its flaws, and of course it is one of the biggest mediums in the game, which does make an impact. When you are so big, it can genuinely be a little bit of an annoyance to have in the game. And of course, cresting things, just coming over ridge lines, trying to use your gun depression. If anyone catches a glimpse of that hull armor, you do get penned quite easily, and it really can be horrible to use in that regard, and yeah, certainly not one of the ones that everyone will be too happy about when you do decide to actually play it, since you will find it a little bit difficult to get damage. Now, of course, picking up 9,800 damage there, a little bit of a toxic play at the end, trying to block the Jaegeru from hitting the opposing Jaegeru, but, you know, I guess if you're going for marks of excellence, it might be something that players do, but either way, a really good result. But let's see whether this thing carries over into the next game. So in amongst the gun buffs that this tank has received, it also got a speed buff, which is allowing it to get into position just slightly quicker. I mean, no one's going to be saying 2 kilometers an hour quicker is going to make a huge impact to how the tank plays, but it certainly doesn't negatively impact the tank. And of course, you are going to be able to compete with some of the other mediums at the tier, since this tank was a fairly sluggish medium. No one's going to say it's one of the most aggressive kind of forward tanks that you can use, and of course be one of the fastest mediums in the game, but of course now it has a little bit less of a pain in getting into forward spots straight away. And of course you can see on this game, taking the position that usually is dominated by mediums with good gun depression and of course turret armor that you're seeing here up against things like the Jaegeru. Really nice gameplay and a nice 1,200 damage so far. Now, other than having really decent standard rounds on this tank, you also get some fantastic heat rounds that allow you to plow around straight through the Jaegeru's lower plate there. I mean, you could do it with standard rounds, but the heat ammunition can certainly help out a lot. And even the superstructure of the Jaegeru, if you weren't looking at it up a hill, then yeah, it would be a lot easier to pen, and you can actually come away with some really nice shots against things like the Jaegeru. You can see here, I'm going for that superstructure, not quite hitting because the accuracy at long ranges of this vehicle is still okay, but you know, you don't have the perfect accuracy that you might see from some of the snipers in the game, but either way, really nice to see some play like this. Now, when you are fully upgraded, you can expect to get a round every 6 seconds, which is really nice when you can deal 390, and then you of course get the nice HE rounds that are 105mm of penetration, and also getting you 490 alpha damage. So you do have these kind of fake Hesh rounds, cheap Hesh rounds, if you know what I mean. They are HE in nature and name, but they do have significantly higher penetration that you would see from some of the standard medium tanks at this tier, and that's really where I think the tank is really doing quite well, because if you're coming up against waffles and you can boost your damage per minute even further, this tank becomes super horrible for the enemies to come up against. When you're on a ridgeline, it's very difficult to consistently deal damage to you because you do have a kind of bouncy turret. Tank will hate heat rounds, but it doesn't really matter when you can charge in and pen everything reliably with your heat rounds yourself, or alternatively using those APCR rounds. So it gets the best 2 types of ammunition as both standard and of course premium, and allowing you to shut down the tracks of this 705A, and you can go for that assistance damage. Now of course the 705A for some reason trying to turn around to take out the Centurion Action X, not quite sure what that was. Now of course you can trundle your way back to the base using the tank and that extra 2 kilometers an hour of speed, and really what you want to do on Lakeville, for example, is get back into the base to defend it. Lakeville's base defense is like super easy for the most part. Essentially you can get into a position like this, or you can take the Skoda position as well to be able to defend the southeastern side of the map. But one of the good things about taking both where the Skoda T50 is on the map and also here is you can get a nice crossfire going, and that really does change the game entirely. Now the better position for if the enemy team win the valley is of course to be where the Skoda is, although being here is also quite nice because you can get side shots in a lot of the tanks that might be pushing quite aggressively, and that allows you to really defend the base quite well. They really have to expose the majority of their tanks, and you can stay hold down like you're seeing here, and of course finding shots on the enemy barrage. But because of the high profile nature of the Centurion Action X, although getting a significant amount of gun depression, we'll find it very annoying to be able to reliably use it trapped in all positions because you are so long that any small bump at the back of your tank is going to make a massive impact at the front of your tank. So one of the things that I love about the Action X is that you are able to fire and take blind fire opportunities that you might not be able to do with some vehicles. It's a minor bonus, I guess. But at the same time you are able to consistently blind fire because you have the rounds in your tank to be able to do so, avoiding any of the unnecessary kind of frantic kind of timing where maybe you start running out of rounds at the end of the game and you can't quite carry. This has a really high carry potential with the amount of rounds that it has. With the Barras finally getting spotted and a nice shell into him, unfortunately not managing to pen with that HE with 105 pen. Disappointing, I know, but either way he's now out of the game, and of course it now opens up the map to be able to take control with the Action X, and that is what this tank does really well. Now, as I've said before, the Action X is certainly not a aggressive vehicle in all intents and purposes because it doesn't get the armor, but it is a great aggressive support tank. That's the difference, is that it cannot hold its own when you're coming up against heavy tanks if it's on a one-on-one engagement. If you're out in an open field you can't use gun depression, but it certainly can rip its way through some of the opponents that you're likely to see. Especially low tier vehicles are going to really fear this tank now with that increased damage per minute and just the capabilities that this tank has to carry games. Now this game really good so far. 7,600 damage done, and of course a little bit of blocked, a little bit of assistance, but now it's time to push forward and use that speed and of course the gun damage per minute to be able to come away with a win. Now of course the hard push towards the enemy vehicles like the Borsig is what you want to be doing at the end of the game, farming up that last bit of damage available and of course coming away with a nice result at the end of it. Now this is the perfect opportunity to utilise that damage per minute because you can sneak up on the last remaining opponents and you can farm them in either side, or B, if you manage to just come into a one-on-one. If you preserve your hit points in the Action X, you'll probably come out quite nicely at the end of it when you're facing up against some of these other vehicles in the game. Now the SU-130 PM on the enemy team, course feeling a little bit worse for wear after that little ram. Now the tank is certainly not a tank you want to be ramming with for the most part, because although it is huge, although it has a little bit of weight to it, it is not that heavy because it is fairly thin armor in general. But yeah, a really good result, 9,000 damage and a brilliant 7 kills taken out in this game. Yeah, a fantastic tank, but probably not a tank that I would say is that overpowered. Now although the tank is a force to be reckoned with, it certainly is no dominator of tier 10 games, and although the buffs that Wargaming have made it way better and certainly not as lackluster as it once was, it is definitely no pushover anymore, and that's where you should be warned when you come up against this thing. But don't be too put off by all of the buffs and changes or some of the videos you might see out there, as this tank still has a lot of weak points and you can certainly take this thing out if you play it against it correctly. Hopefully you guys did enjoy the video. Of course, if you did, please hit that like button because it massively helps out the channel. And of course, if you do want to watch more content, then subscribing is the best way to do that, and checking out the channel for more videos. And of course, if you did subscribe, that's one free hit at the beginning of the battle, I can guarantee you.